On the morning of the 17th of August 1943, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot photographed what appeared to be a cluster of civilian coal barges moored along the Thames estuary near Gravesend. His report noted no military significance, commercial traffic consistent with previous observations. Those barges were, in fact, carrying 847 tons of ammunition, 23 Churchill tanks, and enough petrol to fuel an armoured brigade for a week. 3 days later, a German intelligence analysis dismissed similar sightings along the Medway. Increased barge traffic attributed to domestic coal shortages, no indication of military stockpiling. By September 1943, British planners had successfully concealed the equivalent of an entire armoured division's worth of supplies in plain sight, distributed across what appeared to be perfectly ordinary Thames barges, conducting perfectly ordinary commercial runs. The Germans photographed these vessels dozens of times. They catalogued them. They dismissed them. What looked like Britain's most vulnerable logistics system, slow, obvious, impossible to hide, had become one of its most secure. This shouldn't have worked. River barges are enormous, conspicuous, and confined to predictable routes. Unlike lorries that could scatter into country lanes or trains that could hide in tunnels, barges plodded along at 7 knots through open water, visible from the air for miles. German reconnaissance aircraft flew regular patterns over British waterways, and Luftwaffe photographic interpreters had been trained to spot anything unusual. Changes in traffic patterns, new mooring sites, concentrations of vessels. Standard military intelligence doctrine emphasized disruption of supply lines, and barges represented the perfect target. Slow-moving, difficult to disperse, carrying dense cargo. Yet by late 1943, British inland waterways were moving approximately 18% of military supplies, destined for the build-up to Operation Overlord, and German intelligence had identified fewer than 3% of these movements as militarily significant. Critics in the British Army itself had argued against using barges precisely because they were impossible to conceal from aerial observation. They were right about the visibility. They were catastrophically wrong about what visibility meant. Military logistics theory in 1943 emphasized speed and dispersal. The American approach, which British planners studied extensively, favored truck convoys, fast, flexible, able to scatter if attacked. A single lorry carried perhaps 3 tons, but a convoy of 200 lorries could disperse across dozens of routes, making comprehensive aerial reconnaissance effectively impossible. The German approach to logistics security relied on night movement and camouflage netting, hide the movement itself. Both doctrines agreed on one principle. Large, slow concentrations of cargo were inherently vulnerable. Standard military thinking emphasized that anything visible from the air was already compromised. British river barges appeared to violate every principle of secure logistics. A single Thames barge measured roughly 27 meters in length, displaced between 80 and 120 tons when loaded, and moved at approximately 6 to 8 knots in favorable conditions. They were entirely visible from above, no overhead cover, no ability to hide under trees or in barns like lorries. A reconnaissance aircraft at 6,000 meters altitude could photograph a 20-mile stretch of river in a single pass, capturing every barge in transit. The vessels followed fixed routes determined by canal and river geography. You couldn't divert a barge convoy through different terrain in the way you might redirect lorries. German intelligence officers had detailed maps of every British waterway, every lock, every mooring site. The technical specifications made matters worse. Barges sat low in the water when fully loaded, making their cargo conspicuous. A barge carrying tanks couldn't hide them beneath the tarpaulin. The shapes were too distinctive, the weight distribution too obvious. Petrol barges were even more vulnerable. The cylindrical drums and Bowser tanks were instantly recognizable to trained photo interpreters. British operational planners at the Ministry of War Transport calculated that a single Luftwaffe bombing run could destroy a dozen barges moored together, eliminating perhaps 1,000 tons of supplies in minutes. The maths seemed irrefutable. Barges were too slow to evade, too large to hide, too valuable to risk. What military intelligence experts had failed to consider was that aerial reconnaissance doesn't actually see everything, it sees anomalies. A German photo interpreter examining reconnaissance images of the Thames estuary in 1943 wasn't looking at each vessel individually. He was scanning for changes, concentrations, patterns that differed from baseline commercial activity. The secret was in maintaining that baseline whilst embedding military cargo within it. British planners realised that Britain's inland waterways had never stopped operating commercially throughout the war. Coal barges still moved anthracite from Newcastle to London. Grain barges still ran along the Kennet and Avon Canal. Industrial material still travelled the Midlands Canal network. To German reconnaissance, British waterways looked exactly as they had in 1939. Busy, commercial, civilian. The reality of Britain's barge fleet provided perfect camouflage infrastructure. In 1943, approximately 4,200 barges remained operational across British inland waterways. Of these, roughly 2,800 were engaged in genuine commercial traffic, moving coal, grain, building materials, industrial supplies. The Ministry of War Transport didn't requisition barges exclusively for military use. Instead, they mixed military cargoes into the existing commercial fleet. A barge might carry coal from Yorkshire to London one week, ammunition to a forward staging area the next week, then return to commercial service carrying scrap metal. From 6,000 metres altitude, they all looked identical. British operational security officers established strict protocols for maintaining commercial appearance. Military barges used civilian livery, the same weathered paint schemes, the same company markings, even the same registration numbers as commercial vessels. When loaded with military cargo, barges received superficial civilian cladding. A load of ammunition crates might be stacked and covered with tarpaulins stenciled with commercial coal company logos. Tank decks were surrounded by false wooden sides painted to resemble coal bulkheads. Petrol bowsers were concealed beneath canvas covers that matched the profile of grain hoppers. The goal wasn't to make military cargo invisible, that was impossible. The goal was to make it look like everything else on Britain's waterways. What actually mattered was timing and distribution. German reconnaissance flights followed predictable schedules. Weather permitting, the Luftwaffe photographed major British ports and transport arteries every 3 to 5 days. British intelligence tracked these flights through radar and observer corps reports. The Ministry of War Transport scheduled military barge movements to coincide with surges in commercial traffic. When a reconnaissance flight was expected, military barges would be interspersed among commercial vessels, creating the appearance of normal traffic density. A photo interpreter might see 15 barges between London and Gravesend, entirely consistent with pre-war commercial patterns, without realising that 5 carried military cargo. The definitive test came during Operation Starkey in September 1943, a deception operation designed to convince the Germans that an invasion of France was imminent. British planners needed to move enormous quantities of supplies to staging areas in Kent and Sussex without alerting German intelligence. Between the 3rd and 9th of September, the Ministry of War Transport moved 127 barges carrying approximately 11,400 tons of military supplies, ammunition, vehicles, fuel and rations along the Thames and Medway rivers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flew 8 sorties over these waterways during this period, photographing the entire route multiple times. Post-war analysis of German intelligence reports revealed the extraordinary success of the deception. Of the 127 military barges photographed, German photo interpreters identified exactly 4 as possibly military. 3 of these identifications were false positives, commercial barges carrying scrap metal that happened to be moored near a military installation. The 4th was a barge genuinely carrying ammunition, but the German report classified it as low probability, requires confirmation, and no follow-up action was taken. A captured German intelligence officer, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, later described his unit's analysis process. We were looking for concentrations, for new mooring facilities, for changes in traffic density. The Thames barges looked exactly as they had in our baseline imagery from 1940. There was nothing anomalous to investigate. The human element reinforced the technical deception. British barge crews were drawn from the existing pool of civilian watermen, men who had worked these routes for decades, who knew every lockkeeper and harbour master, who maintained the same routines regardless of cargo. A German agent operating in Kent, later arrested by M115, reported observing normal commercial barge traffic, consistent with coal and agricultural movements. He had in fact watched 3 ammunition barges and 1 carrying artillery pieces pass through Gravesend locks. His report to his handlers dismissed them as insignificant because the crews showed no military bearing or security consciousness, typical Thames bargemen. The casualty figures, or rather their absence, demonstrate the effectiveness of the camouflage. Between January 1943 and June 1944, British inland waterways moved approximately 284,000 tons of military cargo classified as critical for invasion preparation. The Luftwaffe conducted 312 bombing raids against British logistics targets during this period. 0 barges carrying military cargo were deliberately targeted. The few barge losses that occurred, 11 vessels sunk by mines, 3 by opportunistic strafing attacks, were carrying commercial cargoes. German operational planners consistently directed bomber resources toward rail yards, port facilities and road convoys. The barges, plodding along in plain sight, remained invisible. This wasn't accidental improvisation. British operational security doctrine had learned hard lessons from the disastrous visibility of Operation Sea Lion preparations in 1940, when German barge concentrations in Channel ports were immediately obvious to RAF reconnaissance. The Ministry of War Transport and MI5 security section developed what they termed contextual camouflage, the principle that objects remain invisible when they conform to expected patterns, regardless of objective visibility. Commanders weren't clinging to barges out of desperation. They knew something that conventional military logistics theory overlooked. Battlefields aren't clean environments where unusual equals military. In total war, civilian and military infrastructure blur together. Britain's landscape in 1943 was saturated with military activity. Airfields, camps, supply dumps, convoys. Against this background, German reconnaissance had to prioritise. Photo interpreters developed mental models. Military supplies move in military vehicles, through military infrastructure, following military patterns. Commercial barges following commercial routes, operating with commercial crews, displaying commercial behaviours fell outside this model. The deeper principle was psychological exploitation of analyst fatigue. A German photo interpreter examined hundreds of images daily. Each photograph of the Thames might contain 30 to 50 barges. Analysing each individual vessel was impossible. Interpreters scanned for anomalies that warranted closer examination. British operational security deliberately ensured military barges displayed no anomalies. They didn't congregate in unusual locations. They didn't deviate from historical routes. Their numbers didn't spike above peacetime baselines. When everything looks normal, nothing triggers detailed investigation. British planners also understood that concealment isn't binary. A lorry convoy might be individually less visible than a barge, but a convoy of 200 lorries creates a signature. Dust clouds, traffic disruption, road wear patterns visible from altitude. Concentrating supplies in lorry parks creates obvious targets. Barges, by contrast, spread cargo across dozens of vessels moving independently through a network of waterways. A single reconnaissance photograph might capture one barge carrying 20 tons of ammunition, but that barge would be visually identical to the 3 commercial barges photographed alongside it. The military cargo was hidden not by covering it, but by drowning it in similar-looking civilian activity. The success of barge camouflage required meticulous attention to detail that went far beyond slapping civilian paint on military cargo. British operational security teams developed what modern intelligence analysts would recognise as signature management, the systematic control of every observable characteristic that might betray military purpose. Loading procedures were designed to maintain authentic civilian profiles. Commercial barges typically loaded in specific patterns, coal piled highest at the stern to improve water balance, grain distributed evenly to prevent shifting, machinery positioned over the strongest hull sections. Military barges replicated these patterns. When carrying ammunition, crates were stacked to match the visual profile of coal loads, highest at the stern, tapered toward the bow. Camouflage wasn't applied after loading. It was integral to the loading process itself. Stevedores working military cargoes received training in commercial loading techniques, ensuring that even weight distribution and deck arrangement matched civilian standards. The devil was in the details that German photo interpreters had been trained to spot. Commercial barges accumulated specific wear patterns, paint weathering in consistent locations, rust stains from cargo residue, wooden deck wear along traffic paths. Military barges in pristine condition would have screamed recently requisitioned. British maintenance crews deliberately aged military vessels, applying false rust stains, scuffing paint to match wear patterns of genuinely commercial barges, even installing worn equipment, battered tillers, frayed ropes, dented fenders, salvaged from decommissioned vessels. Crew behaviour was equally controlled. German intelligence had learned to identify military vessels by observing crew discipline and behaviour. Soldiers unloading from transport ships moved with military precision. Civilian stevedores did not. British barge crews were genuine watermen, not soldiers in disguise. When military cargo needed to be loaded or unloaded under security, actual civilian crews were temporarily replaced by soldiers trained to replicate civilian working methods. Slower, less organised, with frequent tea breaks, and the casual inefficiency that characterised British dockside labour. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot flying low over the Medway would see bargemen lounging on deck, smoking, working at a leisurely pace, exactly what he expected to see. The mooring patterns reinforced the deception. Military logistics typically concentrate supplies near distribution points, rail yards, forward supply depots, military ports. British military barges deliberately avoided these concentrations. They moored at commercial wharves alongside civilian vessels at locations that had served commercial traffic for decades. A barge carrying tank components might moor at a coal wharf in Erith, next to 3 barges genuinely carrying coal. Unloading occurred at night or under cover, but during daylight, when reconnaissance was likely, the barges sat idle, indistinguishable from commercial vessels waiting for berth space. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe intelligence personnel revealed the systematic cognitive failures that made British barge camouflage so effective. Oberst Friedrich Auerbach, former head of photographic interpretation for Luftwaffe III, explained the doctrine that blinded German analysis. Our training emphasized detecting change. We overlaid current reconnaissance images with baseline imagery from previous months or years. Anything new, new buildings, new roads, new concentrations of vehicles, warranted investigation. The British barges showed no change. The Thames looked in 1943 exactly as it had in our 1939 imagery. German intelligence had fallen victim to baseline bias. Because British waterways had maintained commercial operations throughout the war, German analysts had catalogued this activity as civilian background. Their analytical framework assumed military logistics would appear as deviations from this background. Sudden increases in barge numbers, new mooring facilities, concentration of vessels near military installations. British operational security ensured none of these deviations occurred. Military barge traffic simply replaced commercial traffic, maintaining constant overall density. The numbers reveal the scale of the intelligence failure. Between January 1943 and May 1944, British barges moved approximately 427,000 tons of military supplies via inland waterways, representing roughly 18% of total logistics for Operation Overlord preparation. German intelligence identified approximately 12,000 tons of this, less than 3%, as military cargo. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance photography was technically excellent. The failure was interpretive. German analysts saw the barges, photographed them in detail, and dismissed them because they looked exactly like what they were supposed to look like: civilian commercial vessels. Captured German intelligence assessments demonstrate the completeness of the deception. A March 1944 report on British logistics preparations noted, "Road and rail traffic shows significant increases consistent with invasion preparation. Port activity at Southampton and Portsmouth markedly elevated. Recommend increased reconnaissance of these vectors." The report mentioned Thames barge traffic only once. Commercial waterway traffic remains consistent with historical patterns, minimal military significance. This assessment was written whilst dozens of military barges, carrying everything from ammunition to vehicle parts, moved through the very waterways the report dismissed. The psychological dimension was equally important. German intelligence officers were overwhelmed by the volume of reconnaissance data. Britain's industrial landscape in 1943 was vast, complex, and saturated with legitimate military targets. Analysts faced constant pressure to identify priority threats: airfields, radar stations, supply concentrations that warranted bombing resources. In this context, barges that looked, behaved, and moved like civilian commercial traffic fell below the threshold of investigation. They were logged, catalogued, and filed as background noise. The strategic consequences of successful barge camouflage extended far beyond simple cargo transport. By creating a secure, undetected logistics channel, British planners gained operational flexibility impossible with conventional transport. When rail lines were bombed or road convoys disrupted, barges provided resilient alternative routing. More significantly, the invisible barge fleet allowed British deception operations to maintain the appearance of normal activity in southern England, while secretly staging enormous supply concentrations. Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign designed to mislead Germans about invasion timing and location, relied partly on controlling what German reconnaissance didn't see. British planners needed to stage genuine supplies in southern England for the actual Normandy invasion, while simultaneously creating phantom supply concentrations near Dover to suggest a Pas-de-Calais invasion. Barges made this possible. Real supplies moved via barge to actual staging areas near Portsmouth and Southampton, remaining invisible to German reconnaissance. Meanwhile, dummy installations near Dover were designed to look conspicuous, creating the signature that German analysts expected military preparations to show. Between March and May 1944, British barges moved approximately 73,000 tons of ammunition and 31,000 tons of petrol to forward staging areas within 20 miles of embarkation ports. German intelligence identified none of this movement as militarily significant. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed these waterways 127 times during this period. Post-war analysis of German invasion planning documents showed that German commanders believed British supply concentrations were located primarily in East Anglia and Kent, exactly where deception operations wanted them to look, and far from the actual concentrations in Hampshire and Dorset. The efficiency gains were substantial. A single barge could carry the equivalent load of 20 lorries whilst consuming far less fuel, critical in a war where petrol was severely rationed. Barges moved at 7 knots, but they moved continuously, unaffected by road congestion or the need to rest drivers. The Thames waterway network could sustain a throughput of approximately 8,000 tons per day, equivalent to 400 lorry journeys, with minimal infrastructure requirements. This capacity operated in plain sight, photographed regularly, never attacked. The human cost that wasn't incurred demonstrates the true value of the deception. Had German intelligence correctly identified British barge traffic as military logistics, the Luftwaffe possessed sufficient bomber resources to devastate this transport network. The comprehensive bombing campaign against British waterways, locks, mooring facilities, barges themselves could have killed hundreds of civilian crew members and destroyed thousands of tons of supplies. The disruption to Operation Overlord preparations would have been substantial. Instead, the barges plodded along unmolested, their crews sleeping safely in their cabins, their cargo reaching destination intact. The best military camouflage doesn't just hide targets, it prevents attacks from being launched in the first place. What made British barge camouflage work wasn't any single technical trick, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how intelligence analysis functions under conditions of information overload. Modern military doctrine calls this signature management, controlling not just visibility but interpretation. The principle extends far beyond physical camouflage to encompass every observable characteristic. Movement patterns, communication signatures, logistical footprints. The lesson proved prophetic for post-war intelligence conflicts. During the Cold War, Soviet military theorists studied British barge operations extensively, incorporating the principle of hiding in noise into their own operational security doctrine. The concept, military activity becomes invisible not by being hidden, but by being drowned in similar-looking civilian activity. Modern stealth technology represents a continuation of this principle, not making aircraft invisible, but making them indistinguishable from background radar clutter. British barge operations demonstrated that technological sophistication isn't always necessary for effective concealment. The barges themselves were primitive, wooden hulls, diesel engines, no advanced equipment. The camouflage required no sophisticated materials, just paint, tarpaulins, and careful attention to commercial appearance. What made the system work was operational discipline, maintaining civilian patterns, controlling crew behaviour, timing movements to coincide with reconnaissance schedules. The sophistication lay in understanding the enemy's intelligence process and exploiting its limitations. Critics had argued that barges were impossible to conceal from aerial observation. They were right about the physics. The barges were absolutely visible, but they misunderstood what visibility means in intelligence contexts. An object can be physically visible yet analytically invisible if it conforms to expected patterns. German photo interpreters saw British barges in every reconnaissance image. They simply didn't recognise them as military targets, because the barges looked exactly like what Thames bargemen had been operating for centuries. The final irony emerged in post-war intelligence assessments. When Allied intelligence officers examined captured German reconnaissance photographs of British waterways, even they struggled to identify which barges were carrying military cargo. Without prior knowledge of cargo contents, the military barges were indistinguishable from civilian vessels. The camouflage had been so effective that it fooled even the people who designed it. A British intelligence officer reviewing the photographs noted, "I examined images of the Medway from March 1944. I knew military barges were present, we'd planned the movements, but looking at the photographs, I couldn't tell which barges were ours. They looked like everything else on the river. That's when I understood why the Germans never spotted them." Britain turned river barges into camouflage platforms not through technological innovation, but through psychological insight. They understood that modern intelligence drowns in data, that analysts filter for anomalies, that the expected becomes invisible. By maintaining the appearance of civilian normality, military barges moved through Britain's waterways in plain sight, photographed dozens of times, never recognised, never attacked. German reconnaissance saw everything and understood nothing. The barges were too obvious to be military, and that made them perfectly safe.